I want my US flag to show.
All right, you're good to go.
We're ready?
Yeah.
Good afternoon. I want to mention two things from last time when we were talking about Vietnam. Number one, Ruth Campbell called me and wanted to know what I was doing living on a French rubber plantation. And I was living there with 6,000 other guys. And we were there because it was the headquarters of the 1st Infantry Division. And that way they could protect me because I didn't want to get shot at. And then Louis Weil called and let me know that he had met a number of the Vietnamese Catholics that had left Vietnam after the war was over as boat people. And they had come to where he was teaching at the Graduate School of Theology. And they had been very successful here and had succeeded in making a lot of money. And one of them dedicated a lectureship. So some people in the audience had questions or at least wanted to make comments. I think that we didn't spend much time with either the Korean War or the Vietnam War. This week, I'm showing a couple of films that deal with it. One is William Holden and Jennifer Jones in Love is the Many Splendid Thing, because in that film at the end, William Holden dies in the Korean War. And the second film is Sayonara by James Michener. And in that one, Marlon Brando is a fighter pilot in the Korean War. And in both cases, they have tragic endings because Jennifer Jones plays a Eurasian. It's very difficult for her to think about marrying a Caucasian. And the same thing happens in Sayonara between a Japanese and an American. Sad are those stories. But I thought that what was most important about both, and that we didn't talk about, and I will now, is that we have drifted away from the Constitution. You might have noticed that recently, but we did then. Harry Truman never asked for a declaration of war. What happened was the war started. We went to the UN. We got a vote by the UN to condemn the invasion of the North into the South. And for the rest of the war, Truman called that war a police action. And there's no such thing in the American Constitution. You're either at war or not. And if you're at war, you have to ask the permission of the Congress. You have to get a vote, particularly from the Senate of the United States. And he did not do that. And then in the case of Vietnam, nobody had anything. There was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin. The US Navy ship Turner Joy was on station offshore beyond the 12-mile limit, let alone the 3-mile. And it was fired at by North Vietnamese PT boats. And so Johnson got a resolution condemning that action. And that was it. So we have the Gulf of Tonkin resolution as the whole meaning for an 8-year war. And that's not what it says in the Constitution. The Constitution is very clear. Two things are very important. If you want some money from the American people, you must get it passed as a bill by the House. The House has authority over money. And if you want a declaration of war, like FDR did, then you go and ask the Senate, and you get a declaration of war against Japan. You just don't make it up. And the Congress began to understand that after these two wars, and they then passed War Powers Act, and Richard Nixon vetoed it. And the Congress was so annoyed they voted it in anyway they overrode his veto. But it hasn't helped much, even in the case, unfortunately, of Obama. His little Libyan adventure was not with the permission of. Now, you might say, well, you know, things need to be done in a hurry. And so there's a clause for that. Let me give you an example. Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory. He did not have permission to spend that money, but he spent it anyway. Gave the money to Napoleon, and then suddenly we had New Orleans, Louisiana, the Mississippi Valley, and much of this huge West that we got with the Louisiana Purchase. Now, there is a part of the Constitution that would pertain in the following way. When our Constitution was written, mainly by James Madison, It was based on a famous document by John Locke, the great 17th century British philosopher. And it contains a clause which is one, quote, the prerogative of the sovereign, end quote, which simply means that the leader, whether king or in parliament, the prime minister, or in our case, the president, has the right to act immediately when there is a crisis. We don't have to stand around and wait for everybody to get to Washington to sit around and then debate. He can act. But then, as soon as he can get the Congress or the Parliament together, he must throw himself on the mercy of this representative body and tell them what he's done and ask for their permission then. And if he gets it, then he's okay. And if he's not, he can be impeached for doing something that's illegal. You just can't go to war because you want to. And we've had several people realize that. In the Nixon years, as Nixon was drinking himself to death in the White House, waiting for the axe to fall at Watergate, the Secretary of Defense realized that this man was so unstable that he might lead us to war. And so the Secretary of Defense, Schlesinger, he ordered that any orders for war, either launching missiles or whatever, should not be obeyed unless it had his signature, meaning he was canceling the president out. So you should be aware of that. We have been on the slippery slope to nowhere, and it's gotten us into nothing but trouble. So we've covered that a little bit. If you haven't, let me tell you another story, how republics die. We aren't likely to last forever as a republic. Once there was a great republic called the Roman Republic of 2,400 years ago. And it lasted for quite some time. And then there was a man, a brilliant man by the name of Julius Caesar, who did what he wasn't supposed to do. He brought his 10th legion from Gaul onto the Italian peninsula and then down and crossed the famous river, the Rubicon. No one was to bring a military unit into Rome. It was a republic. And he did it. Vini Vici Vidi, he came to Rome with a military force. And then people who are of a liberal mind killed him. You all know the play, Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare. Trouble is, Shakespeare got it wrong. Brutus was the good guy, and Caesar was the bad guy. So you might keep that in mind when you think about presidents who are calling people like the head of the North Korean government Rocket Man and rattling rockets. We don't do that. We shouldn't do that. And it's illegal to do that. But there we are. Now, I thought I would turn our attention, though, to the very beginning of us as a nation. We fought 2 wars at the beginning with Great Britain. Strange who would pick them as the enemy, but we were 13 little colonies on the Atlantic seaboard, and we wanted our independence. We finally had it. We had Patrick Henry down there at that church in Richmond saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." And we had people up in Philadelphia, and a young Jefferson was there. And Jefferson was writing a document late at night. He didn't even want to be in Philadelphia. He hated Philadelphia. But he sat down and he wrote, quote, "All men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, Franklin did not like the idea of pursuit of happiness. He wanted to say life, liberty, and property, because property was a building stone of the old English sense of revolution. I would have changed it different from Franklin and different from the time it was. I would have said all human beings are created equal. They're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. But Jefferson didn't ask me, and he disregarded Franklin. We have the Declaration of Independence the way it is. And at its day and its moment, it's inspired many people. Franklin did warn all those who signed the Declaration that they were signing their death warrant, because in fact, if the British won the American War of Independence, all of those who signed would be strung up, killed, dead. So it was a courageous thing to have done, and we did it, and we went to war. Now, the war that we celebrate today is unbelievably a small part of what really happened. We like to talk about Lexington and Concord and the shot fired around the world. We like to talk about Paul Revere and that ride he took, that midnight ride. And those silly people in New England are recreating that all the time. They have little groups that celebrate the Concord and Lexington victories. And some guy gets to ride a horse around and say, the British are coming. Well, they did finally come in force. A British fleet sailed, two major figures, the Howe brothers, one a general, one an admiral. They came and they anchored off of Sandy Hook, which is a place right off of New York Harbor. And then they decided to take New York, and they did. Now, the wonderful thing to remember is that the New Englanders who were hot for this war realized they needed the South to join them. And the way they could get the South, they thought, was to get this guy who lived at Mount Vernon, named George Washington, Colonel Washington, now going to be General Washington, to take command of the troops. So, of course, Washington comes, goes up to New England, and then he succeeded in losing every battle he ever fought except the last one.
George Washington?
Yes, George Washington lost all of his battles. The Battle of Long Island, the Battle of Brooklyn, the Battle of Harlem Heights. He lost New York. He soon lost Philadelphia. He lost everything except the last battle. His great success was keeping a little bit of an army together through terrible winters like at Valley Forge. Because the problem was the colonial people didn't have an army. They have these little civil groups that met, and they weren't very good, and certainly weren't trained. While they were at Valley Forge, a German, von Steuben, tried to come and help us train. But it was of little good. The best thing he could do was run away and keep running. He had been in a war before this on the English side. It's called the French and Indian War. And he had gone out because he had many claims himself. His brother was the rich one, not George. But George did have claims on territories on the other side of the Allegheny Mountains. In fact, every state had people who had claims out in the West, as it was called, the wild west of Ohio and the Ohio River. And so it was that he has experienced leading men at least, but now he simply led them all the time to defeat. He had a hard time keeping them together because these local militia only signed up for 6 months and then they wanted to go home, and they went home without permission. So people came and people went, nothing seemed to stay, nothing could be counted on. So you didn't want to find yourself up against a regular British army, except in two cases. And they're the cases that give you the real nature of the American Revolutionary War. One is in the South and one is in the North. I'll give you the North first. There is the city of New York City and the places nearby. People were living on Long Island in the American Revolution. But if you went up the Hudson around, say, 30 miles, it was wilderness. And way up the Hudson is a valley, the Mohawk Valley. And in the Mohawk Valley are a lot of brand new farmers trying to tame the land and farm it. And they were having a lot of trouble with the people we call Native Americans. In those days, they called them bloodthirsty Indians. And so they had a problem on their hands. And when they heard that this flamboyant jerk known as Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, he was a British general, was coming down from Canada with a force and he was recruiting the Indians to fight with him. This ignited the Mohawk Valley, and they came storming out of that valley with General Gates, one of Washington's junior officers, in command. And there at Saratoga, today one of the great cultural highlights of going upstate New York. Saratoga has a great music festival, great ballet festival. All of these are summer places where the New York City Ballet, New York City Opera goes in the summertime. It's also a place for racehorses, and it's also a famous film made there by Ingrid Bergman called Saratoga Trunk. Saratoga is a wonderful resort today. It was nothing then. And so you have General John Burgoyne, and he's a very typical British snob. He comes down in red velvet. He looks like a dandy off the streets of London. He brings with him a full table, so he dines on French wines and wonderful food out in the wilderness. And he has with him 3 musicians, very much like, say, Sean is in our music group here, the Hootenannies. So you have 3 Hootenannies in the middle of the wilderness. So what are they going to do? They're going to play music for him, a little Mozart here and a little Mozart there. In the middle of the wilderness, you just have to picture this. And he's surrounded by these Mohawk Indians. And this has upset the settlers in the Mohawk Valley. And so they all come together with Gates, and lo and behold, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne loses the great battle at Saratoga, which gives the American cause a great lift, because all Washington has been doing is running away. And now we have the battle in the North that begins to set the tone for what's going to happen. In the meantime, a British General, Clinton, has decided that he will send a force, which he can do because he controls the ocean, south to South Carolina. Now, let me tell you something about South Carolina. It's always and remains a troublesome state, whether it was in the Confederacy when they were called fire eaters, or whether it was before. They were settled in large measure, not by the English, but by a group known as French Huguenots. French Huguenots were French Protestants. And the great Cardinal Richelieu had decided that France was to be a Catholic country. And so he drove the Protestants out of France. And many of them sailed for the the colonies then, and settled in South Carolina. They became very rich rice farmers in the city of Charleston, which is on a peninsula with 2 rivers, one to the north and one to the south. So you have Clinton coming down there and setting up a force in the Carolinas. This way you're going to outflank the force that Washington has in between the city of Philadelphia, which is now occupied, and the city of Charleston. But there is an odd person living in the swamps. He's called the Swamp Fox by the British. And he leads a group of Carolinians on raids, not battles. It raids, like he waits till they're asleep at night and then sneaks in and blows up their cantonment area, and then disappears again into the swamp where he can't be found. So he earns the title of the Swamp Fox, and he is, in fact, matched in his own way by a British officer, Tarleton. And we have a very famous saying from this time, Tarleton's Revenge, because Tarleton just didn't believe in taking prisoners. He had a view that they were nothing but a pain, and so he'd kill them. Take no prisoners. And this is very bad news because, of course, it's against anybody's rule of law. And it also causes the southern part of the campaign to take up his view. And so when the swamp fox took a prisoner, he killed him too. So it was not good to be a prisoner. Might be good to escape, but keep running and running and running, because you don't want to be caught by either side in this take no prisoner routine. Finally, it gets so bad that another general comes, a British nobleman. Remember, all this is being done in the court of George III, a real idiot for a king back in London. They passed all kinds of laws, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, all these things that are celebrated in American history because we did all kinds of little things, like we took all the tea. They were going to tax the tea, and we had the Boston Tea Party, and we threw the tea in the sea. Well, no one really gave a damn about that old tea. What they cared about was who was going to control these rebellious, insurgent colonies, because we were an insurgency. We were fighting an insurgency war against the British Empire. And we were sending whoever we had who was any good, that was Jefferson, Franklin, and the Adamses, to another city called Paris. Lucky guys, they got to go to Paris. Everyone else got to stay and be killed. And they went to Paris to beg the French to give us aid. And the French, of course, decide to do so because it's in their interest to do whatever they can to infuriate the British. Perfidious Albion, they call Britain. Now, they had seen twice what had happened. And maybe you don't know this chapter, but somebody does know it and has remembered it to this day. When we broke 13 colonies, we decided on our own that the Canadians were dying to split also. And so we sent an expedition into Canada for them to become the 14th colony. And guess what? The Canadians didn't agree, and they didn't want to join us, and they threw us out by beating us up. We're going to do the same thing again some years later, never having learned our lesson. In 1812, we're going to go back to Canada, tell them to join us, and they throw us out again. The Canadian adventures. And who remembers that? Nobody. They don't talk about it in American history courses today because they don't want to know about it. But the Canadians talk about it. They have a wonderful book called The Good Americans. And that means The Good Americans, which basically tells the story of those Americans who not only didn't agree, but they left the American colonies and came to live in Canada. And they live there to this very day. Their grandchildren and others can trace their history back to being American Tories who disagreed with the revolution. And when we went ahead with the revolution, rather than stay, they left the 13 colonies and moved permanently to Canada. And then when they heard that we were coming to get them to join back up, they joined the forces that threw us out twice. Of course, that's never mentioned in American history. All we talk about is Paul Revere, Concord, Lexington, Betsy Ross making that flag, which are all fine and dandy, but they are not a permanent part of what really happened to us when we had to fight this revolution, which was a very bitter, ugly war. And we tried the best we could where we could. We survived at Valley Forge. You should go to Valley Forge when you have a chance. It's a wonderful site. It's been perfectly preserved. You can see Werner von Steuben, the German who came to help, practiced and ran the American soldiers through a marching routine so they at least know their left foot from their right foot. It was a difficult war. Washington had a difficult time. Washington himself was not a rich person. His brother was the one who owned Mount Vernon. It's named for him, Vernon. So it's a very complex situation, and you shouldn't just do a rah, 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 wave the flag kind of thing. It did finally give us independence. which is what we wanted. But how did we get that? Well, it's another story we don't emphasize. But once upon a time, there was a French king who was convinced by his minister Versailles to help those strange Americans because they would hurt the British. And that's what the French wanted. The French had already lost Canada one time. So it was that the French did give us help. And mighty was the help when it came. When the French decided, they sent their fleets, 2 of them, one from Toulon in the Mediterranean and one from the French Atlantic coast, and they both went into North American waters. One in particular came to the waters off of the Virginia Capes. There is in Virginia a very large bay, the largest bay in the United States, 4 times larger than the Bay Area, or the San Francisco Bay. And at its entry, there are 2 capes, Cape Charles and Cape Henry. And one of the French fleets destroyed a British fleet that had come down and then entered dangerous waters, entered the Chesapeake, and then got word that a strange British guy who didn't know what he was doing, the Earl Cornwallis, had landed in Carolina, had decided that he would try and capture the swamp fox. He never succeeded. Marion Davis stayed alive till the very end of the war. So frustrated, he then marched north. This is Cornwallis with another British army into North Carolina. And through North Carolina, he then entered Virginia. And he tried to capture, and did finally capture, the state capital, which had moved from Jamestown, the early settlement in 1607, which had then moved to Williamsburg, to the House of Burgesses, and then it moved from Williamsburg to Richmond. And so Cornwallis piles into Richmond. But by the time he gets there, the governor of Virginia, who happens to now be Thomas Jefferson, flees. He's just as good as Washington is at running away. And so while Cornwallis captures Richmond, he doesn't capture the leadership. And then he makes a fateful decision. He's very deep inside the country. And so he wants to get near to the sea so he can get reinforcements or be lifted off. So he marches down the very famous Virginia Peninsula, heading slowly down. Now he and the others in South Carolina had caused a furor when it was announced that the British were arming black slaves. In the South, in those days and later, the very idea of arming the slaves was a non-starter. It's not that the slaves didn't want to revolt. In fact, much later in Virginia, there's a very famous slave revolt, the revolt of Nat Turner. And he succeeded in revolting and leading a group of slaves, and quite a number of people were killed, to include whites and then blacks. It ended, in, of course, with Nat Turner's destruction of his slave revolt, the killing of many slaves. But it sent a shiver through the South that maybe these very loyal slaves would in fact take up arms and fire back at their oppressors, which is going to happen in the American Civil War. And then it's going to happen after the famous war between the states, as Southerners call it. But now you have Cornwallis back on the Virginia Peninsula, trying to get down to the tip of the peninsula. And he can then get supplies, or he be lifted as he and his army, 8,000 British regulars, can be lifted off the shore and placed on British warships. But those sneaky, sneaky French have snuck into Chesapeake Bay, and they've gotten word that this man is now coming down towards a place where he could be trapped. Because the word has come to Washington, and he is moving what's left of the Continental Army down through Maryland and into Virginia, and then down the Virginia Peninsula following Cornwallis. So Cornwallis pulls himself into a redoubt. These are a series of defensive positions. You dig them. You dig and pile the dirt up in front of you, and then you have a strong point, and you put your cannon beside it, and you're ready to defend yourself. And you have the river, the York River, at your back. And so therefore, when the British fleet comes, it can come up the river and take you off. So it is that Washington keeps moving. He builds his redoubts. Now, Washington has, it's true, the Continental Army, but more than the Continental Army. He has a French army under the command of General Rochambeau. And Rochambeau brings his army with George Washington's army. So it's a formidable force. And now a French admiral is sailing up the York River and getting right behind Cornwallis's position. So Cornwallis is now caught on both sides, and the bombardment begins, and it's hopeless. So Cornwallis surrenders to Washington. The one victory Washington had, but it was the last victory and the one that mattered. He'd been running and running and running, and now he had stood his ground with 10,000 Frenchmen. And he had as his aide de camp, a man he actually thought of as his adopted son, a French aristocrat, the Marquis de Lafayette. And so the war is going to come to an end. It'll be 2 more years before everyone meets in Paris for the Treaty of Paris. In the Treaty of Paris, the Americans are given their liberty. All this was not for naught. We are free. But you have to remember lots of things happen that we don't celebrate, but we should celebrate. For instance, those people who were at Saratoga with Gates were farmers who lived in the Mohawk Valley. And when they needed fresh meat, they went out and shot it. Wild turkeys, venison from deer, or just a rabbit or a squirrel. Now, if you shoot a rabbit with the arms of the day, armies in those days were basically armed with muskets. That's why they had to get very close to the enemy, because the killing range was only around 50 yards. If you could get everybody to stick together and take the first blast from the enemy so that you can get to be 40 yards, you can really blow up the front line of the enemy, having lost many in your own front line. But a musket is no good with a rabbit. Let's say you shoot a rabbit with a musket. What you have is around 40 to 45 pieces of rabbit, because it's blown the hell out of the rabbit. So what you want to do is have a rifle, a squirrel gun. And many people on the frontier had rifles. The difference in a rifle is it is not a thunderburst. It's an accurate weapon. And you use the word as a verb, rifling, to turn inside the barrel of a weapon a carved, curved area that then sends the bullet down and gives it aerodynamics so that when it comes out, it's accurate out to 300 yards. So you've got your rabbit, you've got your squirrel, you've got your wild boar, you've got your deer, your venison, with one shot. It hasn't blown the hell out of the poor little animal. It's intact. So then you can carry it home to your little hut, wherever you live, and your family has fresh meat. It is important to know that because the frontier was loaded with rifles. They gave up on their muskets the moment they crossed the mountains. They'd found passes in those mountains so they could get out into the wildness of the West. The Great Gap in the Allegheny Mountains in Virginia, the Cumberland Gap. All of these places were used, and all the rivers were used because it was the only way to get heavy produce anywhere. So when you have the plantations of the Old South, not the one you're thinking about, not Gone with the Wind, but of the colonial type, you had in Virginia a crop that you could sell. It wasn't cotton, it was tobacco. Both Virginia and North Carolina raised a great deal of tobacco. They'd send it down their rivers. In the case of Virginia, they'd send it down the James River to the port city of Norfolk. There it would be put in great barns to dry, and then it would be shipped back to the mother country, to England, so that the English, the gentlemen who sat around doing nothing, could snuff their snuff. A strange world it used to be is gone forever now. But it's important to realize that it was a very different world and a very different people. And we do, as Napoleon says, well, the victors are the ones who write the history. So we took the highlights, and we still have Betsy Ross making that flag. We have somebody in Massachusetts riding around like a crazy person on the time of the celebration of our revolution, a kind of Paul Revere, screaming and yelling at midnight that the British are coming. All those things that we celebrate, but we should celebrate the fact that we were an insurgency. And I keep using that word because if you remember, several hundred years later, we are fighting insurgents in Vietnam. That's what they were. And they were fighting for what they thought was their view of liberty. And we were fighting as a colonial power as far as they were concerned. First, they had rid themselves of the French. Now they had to go and rid themselves of us. And they did. As you remember, I emphasized to you, we lost the Vietnam War. And nothing was clearer that we lost. That on a highly celebrated day in Asia, known as the Tet, the celebration of a new year, in the famous Tet of 1968, out of nowhere, 50,000 insurgents left the jungles, left the mountains, and came down to the coast of Vietnam. And they took control of over 40 towns and cities. They even came into Saigon and took the Chinese section of Saigon, Sholan. They were even seen on the streets of Jardin, which is the old French section of the city. And suddenly, we Americans woke up and realized there was no light now or ever at the end of the tunnel. And what did Johnson do? He was really unhappy. He announced to the world that he was not going to be the first American to lose a war. Big deal. He lost anyway. And he always referred to this war as a pissant war. Who were these little pissant people anyway, who were fighting against his mighty force? By then we had 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. And the streets of America were full of people demonstrating against the war, demonstrating for civil rights, demonstrating for all kinds of things at home. And finally, in a fit of disbelief, Johnson called on the wise men. These are former government officials at high levels like Dean Acheson, Dean Rusk, and asked them to meet as the wise men. And the head of that committee was Clark Clifford, who had served with Truman. And Clifford had to come to Johnson and tell him, the wise men are recommending that no matter what the cost, you get out of this war. It's destroying our nation. And then we went off to Paris, just like we went off to Paris in the case of the American Revolution. And at Paris, after 2 years of thinking and talking, both sides surrendered, gave up. The American colonies, those insurgent little people who were causing the British so much trouble, the British said, go, go, go away. Stay out of Canada, but go away. And we gladly did. We became this puny little country called the United States of America. 13 colonies had become 13 states. We had a Declaration of Independence, and now we had a Constitution. Both, by the way, terribly flawed. These documents and these leaders were basically Virginia aristocratic planters. The first 4 presidents, interrupted only by 4 years of Adams, but first George Washington for 8 years, Jefferson for 8 years, Madison for 8 years, Monroe for 8 years, are referred to by Americans as, American historians, as the Virginia dynasty. They were all slave owners. So right from the very beginning, right in the compromises that were made so that the Constitution could be approved, and the compromise was that slavery had to be protected in the South to get the Southern states, now free from Britain, to agree to sign on. And their request was granted. And we had to wait for another really ugly war, the ugliest war we ever fought. More people are killed in the American Civil War than all of our other wars combined. It was gruesome. And as many people felt, Lincoln, the liberator, and his side won a just war. Fortunately, Lincoln was assassinated. So you come to a very bitter period of American history known as Reconstruction, which we will not cover today. We'll just try and think through the things that we have talked about. We have drifted away from the idea of getting a declaration of war. We had a phony police action in Korea, 2 years worth of it. And we had a Gulf of Tonkin resolution to go on. Now, of course, it's possible to argue, well, the Congress still voted money every year for those 2 wars, and that's true. Presidents have learned a lesson from Teddy Roosevelt. Back in the beginning of the 20th century, Teddy decided he was going to send the Great White Fleet, our fleet, around the world, friendship visits to everybody. But he didn't have enough money. So he said, well, Congress won't give me the money, but I'm going to send them anyway. And I have enough money to get them halfway around the world. And then I'll announce to the Congress that our fleet is halfway around the world and we don't have any money to bring them back. And then suddenly, of course, Congress will find the money to bring the fleet back. And so they did, trapped by a very slippery guy known as Teddy Roosevelt, the first of the Roosevelts, the man who also gave us the Panama Canal, which then Jimmy Carter gave back to the Panamanians, thank God, so that we could repair the damage that we had done. It's been a long trip through American history, from our days as colonies, through our days as rebels, as insurgents, to days who finally got to win one battle, but it was the last battle. You know, when I was in Vietnam, they used to say, well, we won all the battles here. And that's true. We did win all the battles. Even Tet, we drove those Vietnamese back to the jungle, back to those hills. We killed thousands of them. We retook the city of Saigon. We retook the royal capital at Hue. The Marines had already fought valiantly at Khe Sanh. Yes, but the American people could see disaster and gave up, really gave up on the idea there would ever be victory, and there never was. Another kind of gone with the wind, except it was gone in the Vietnamese case. John McCain was probably right. He, many years after the war, having suffered being a casualty of the war, a POW who had survived his crash in North Vietnam and had been in a POW camp, he went back many decades later, now a senator, to visit the place where he had been. It's called the Hanoi Hilton, in case you're interested. You can go there. It's considered a big tourist site in Hanoi. And he went there and he was very blatant about it. He said, well, the wrong side won. And many people felt that way. But the point was, it wasn't our side. There was a reason, and we didn't seem to get it even years afterwards. I used to hear people in the Pentagon say, well, we won all the battles. Who cares? You lost the war. Washington lost all the battles, but then he won the last one. So who cares except the Americans? We cared greatly because it's our great victory with our French ally. That's why, if you don't know why, people call France our first great alliance. And when the next war comes with Britain, which is 1812, the British are really, really busy. There's a Corsican who has left Corsica decades before and succeeded in rising high during the French Revolution, while the French were busy cutting off all the heads they can of the French nobility, the guillotine. Napoleon rises and sees the evil ones, Robespierre, go to the guillotine, Danton to the guillotine. The revolution is now eating its children. Of course, the king and his Austrian Archduchess Queen have both gone to the guillotine prior to this, as have over 7,000 French nobles. It's a way to clean house, that's for sure. And now Napoleon has conquered Europe. First, of course, he did a revolution at home. He gave the French a new law code, which was quite wonderful. It's still used in Louisiana. The Napoleonic Code is the law code of the state of Louisiana. He reformed the education system. He made sure that you could go, if you were good, to a French university. When I was in Vietnam, living on the French rubber plantation with 6,000 other people, Ruth, I used to watch these French teenagers with their books under their arms going off to a French school And what were they doing? They were studying so they could pass the bac, which is the worldwide exam given by the French nation. And if you pass, you are guaranteed a position in a French university. Now, of course, in part, this was a very French view, which was picked up by the British also, that if you educated the elite of your colony, you're likely to own them for decades to come, because they will be more French than they are native. People used to complain to me that they had met many people who were Vietnamese and they knew the names of every river in France, but they didn't know the names of any rivers in Asia. Yet they lived in Asia. And that was because the French system emphasized France and everything else was secondary. C'est la vie. But in this case, it was generally c'est la guerre, because these wars came and helped change the nature of society. The Canadians to this very day have never gotten over our 2 invasions. They have no desire to be the 14th colony or the 51st, 52nd, 53rd state. They're very happy being Canadians. And why shouldn't they be? They have no death penalty. They have no draft. All guns in Canada are registered. You might think that instead of trying to convince them to join us, that we might go up there and copy them. Maybe we should send Dianne Feinstein, who's always trying to pass a bill about gun control, to Canada. Also, to find out that they've decided to hold Canada together, they will be bilingual. If you want a job in Canada on anything that's national, they're wonderful national railways. They've saved their railroads. They're wonderful. You have to speak both French and English to work on the railroad. If you want to fly as a flight attendant or as a pilot on Air Canada, you have to speak both French and English. They're making sure that the nation stays together in its 2 separate parts, French Canada, Quebec, and English Canada, much of the rest of the nation. So we could learn. What's wrong with learning? It's a hard lesson sometimes to learn. Let me take you back to the Romans for a time. You know, there was an emperor after Caesar in his campaign to break the laws of the Roman Republic. The Republic died as we could die. The Republic dies and there's an empire. Augustus is the first of the emperors. Augustus decides the empire needs to grow bigger. And word has reached Imperial Rome that there is a huge amount of land on the other side of the Rhine River. The Rhine is the frontier of the Roman Empire in Roman Gaul. But on the other side, there's lots more land, forested, full of game, wonderful place. You could award, as they did in the days of the legions, when a legionnaire retired, he was given land that was free. And this land would be wonderful land to settle Roman legionnaires on, to be part of the empire. So Augustus sent 2 cracked legions across the Rhine and into Germany. And there was land there. And there were also Germans there. And these 2 legions struggled to get inside of a big forest, the Teutoburgenwald. Unfortunately, hiding in the forest were Germans with their double-edged axe. And the Legion was not very good at fighting in forests. They needed open space. And so it was excuse me, that the Germans threw their axes in the middle of the forehead of all these legionnaires, and they all died a rather miserable death. And word came back to Rome that Rome had lost 2 of its crack legions. And at that moment, the emperor and the imperial household decided that the Roman Empire would have a frontier on the Rhine, and all the rest would be Germany on the other side. Therefore, the Germans don't speak a Romance language today. They speak German. And the same thing happened in England. England had become a Roman colony. You can see that when you go to Bath, you can see the baths there. The baths are built on top of Roman baths. But there was a strange group of people who were actually Irish in origin. So obviously they're troublemakers. And they are now called the Scottish people, and they're living in what's called Scotland. And they're impossible. You can't civilize them. They come to fight you. They come naked, painted purple, and throwing things at you. And so the Emperor Hadrian just decided, this is too much. So just like someone that you know, currently imperial, the Emperor Hadrian decides to build a wall to keep the Scottish crazy people on the other side. And you can go visit it today. It's called Hadrian's Wall. It's still standing. Over 2,000 years, keeping those Scots who are up there busy making Scottish whiskey anyway, in their side of the wall, and then peaceful, pleasant Roman Britain goes on. The frontier was always like this. The Romans came to a place they couldn't move. They used the Danube as a frontier all the way down to the Black Sea. They used the Sahara Desert as a frontier. So all those many people that we have here working at Piedmont Gardens who come from Algeria or Tunisia or Morocco, they were all within the Roman Empire. And then there came the desert, and that was a frontier that the Romans did not want to cross. So they had a basin, the Mediterranean basin, as the center of their world, and they stayed there. They knew it. And so some people would advise the Americans to stay where they know where they belong and drop these funny excursions elsewhere. We were very lucky when we came to 1812 and the war then. We could have fought France, we could have fought England, we could have fought somebody. We were very warlike. So very much against the wishes of the New England people who were trading heavily with the British people, we went to war with Britain. And the British were fed up with us because they were busy with the Corsican, better known as Napoleon. But they did send a fleet. It sailed in the Chesapeake, it sailed up the Potomac River, it docked at Washington and Alexandria on the Virginia side, and then it proceeded to go down Pennsylvania Avenue and burn the White House down as a message. Stay home, mind your own business. And we were lucky, we escaped. We did have that foolish guy, Andrew Jackson, reconquer New Orleans. We'd already bought it from Napoleon, but the British had taken it back, and now we were going to take it back, and we did. These were serious wars. In the case of 1812, it did ruin the merchants of New England, and they were very bitter about it. They were particularly bitter because it was a Virginian who was president, and he could give a hoot and hell less about British and Boston merchants. And so it came to an end. That's the last war, thank God, that we've fought with Britain. Usually now we fight beside her in great 20th century battles. World War I, we're late, but we get there. World War II, we're late again, but we get there. And then the long Cold War with the Soviet Union, where we were on one side with our allies, and on the other side were the Soviets and their allies. And so it was that this beginning, the American Revolution, Paul Revere. I keep harking back to that because New Englanders, we have a number of New England people living with us here in Peanut Garden, and they probably have heard the reenactment of dear old Paul Revere's ride through the New England countryside. The British are coming, the British are coming. Better that they go and study the insurgency as we knew it at Saratoga with Mohawks. Once those Indians were armed by the British, they'd lost the battle at Saratoga. And Francis Marion, and when he heard that you were arming and freeing slaves, you had a permanent insurgency led by the Carolina Swamp Fox. And then it all ended at Yorktown. French fleet, French army, French money, French guns, and Washington with his aide-de-camp, the Marquis de Lafayette. And then it was over. We all went to Paris, like we'd gone to Paris before, and we'd go later and signed a treaty. It took 2 years, but we finally had our independence. And we want to keep it, I hope, for as long as we can. And now that the music has started, that means it's time for me to be quiet. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed what you heard today. And we'll see you next time when we have one more adventure, this time a war against Mexico, which again was not a wise move and ended in a result that's tragic. Thank you.